Yes, Guyana to the world. Your boy
Globuspan is a Guyanese dialogue moving towards the realization of one nation in one Guyana. It's a platform that offers an all-inclusive discussion with the pros, the cons, the ones that is taken aside, and the ones that stand in the middle. Globuspan believes agreeing and disagreeing are part of the nation's building.
She is a beauty, beautiful Guyana, with wonderful people all over this country.
Globuspan believes every Guyanese voice is part of the nation's building. As we span the globe for voices from the diaspora and those living home, we stand on our commitment that we are all Guyanese working towards one nation in one Guyana. As the world turns on its axis bringing changes, we as Guyanese must adapt to those changes for a better Guyana for all. Globuspan stands on its axis with its belief that one nation, one Guyana, one destiny must include voices from all corners of Guyana.
With many flavor, 6 different people blended together. Raise your flag high in unity, we're family with one destiny. Raise your flag high in unity, we're
So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us this evening on Globuspan 24/7, owned and operated by Mr. Nohar Singh, with Mr. Devin Bissoon as our technical operator. Tonight, we have 3 distinguished personalities to discuss a very important subject. The subject is racial insensitivity in Guyana, and on the other side of the coin is racial sensitivity. They're 2 sides of the same coin. And we want to discuss whether it's being normalized in Guyana or has been normalized in Guyanese society. And to interrogate this subject tonight would be Mr. Vincent Alexander, who is no stranger to this program, a commissioner on Guyana Elections Commission, GCOM. Professor David Hines, Dr. David Hines has been a distinguished personality in Guyanese political analyst, or I should say political pundit. Also, I suppose, was a candidate for office in Guyana as well. And then we have Mr. Ravindra Dev, who served in Parliament for 1 term. Gentlemen, thank you all very much for joining us this evening. Let's begin right away into the subject. Shall we ask the professor first to say racial sensitivity, insensitivity? What is that?
Good evening to all the viewers, and good evening to my co-panelists. Well, you know, in racially divided societies, the issue of racial contestation is always very much part of everyday life. There are times when the institutions in the society conspire to put racial sensitivities high up on the agenda. And there are times when those institutions are overtaken by the politics, the raw politics. And it is then that the whole question of racial insensitivity occurs. Racial insensitivity can occur within the context of racial triumphalism in our winner-take-all system, where parties are organized along racial lines. Whenever one party gets into power, it assumes all the political space, and then that opens the possibility for triumphalism on the part of the leaders and the followers. And as the political situation becomes more and more charged, more and more the question of racial insensitivity occurs. I want to give a quick example the recent incident regarding Mr. Thorne, the sculptor in Guyana, is an example of what I may call racial insensitivity driven by a sense of triumphalism. Now you have racial slurs that are thrown at people every day in this society. But here was a case of a man asking allegedly two people not to park in a parking lot. And here was a man of medium height. He speaks English. He's male, of course, but the response to him is not to his height, not to his language, not to his looks, but to his race. And when you get to that situation, when the first resort is to race, and you get into the realm of racial insensitivity. And one may say, well, that is one incident, but it's not an isolated incident. Over the last 4 years or so, there's been a heightened racial insensitive remarks made on both sides of the political divide, and therefore from both sides of the racial divide. The question is it being normalized in the society? Is it something that the authorities are prepared to find ways not to facilitate? Or is it a case where the authorities are prepared to be selective in the way they go after racial insensitivity?
So I think that's a good question that you pose. So let's see if there is additional remarks about the definition of racial insensitivity. Let's ask the lawyer, Mr. Ravindra Dev.
Well, good evening, viewers, and also to my fellow panelists and to you, Vishnu. I think it's a very critical topic, this whole question of race. But basically, we're talking about racism, and that is the issue. And we should understand, that distinction. And in these matters, we can't forget how these things were formed, because these are all social constructs. And in the manner in which it was formed is very critical for us today, because these things become systemic. They inhere into the body politic, the fabric of the society. So as to its sensitivity or insensitivity, we have to question how come it's there. That to me is very critical. And I've spoken about this question very much from a position of the theorist, the Latin American theorist, Aníbal Quijano, who talks about the coloniality of power. That while colonialism, in which race and racism were constructed out of Europe's quote unquote encounter with us in the third world, it never went away, whether with our independence or whether with whatever happened. It remains there, and he calls it coloniality, and is there, and we have to discern it. And the biggest element in both colonialism and coloniality is the whole structure of a system of racial hierarchies. And that is what I think all of us, not only in Guyana, but in the world, that after 1492 and after the enslavement of Africans to labor in the so-called New World, there was this whole theory of race in which racism was normalized back then. And it inheres in every institution that has been created since then. It inheres. So whether it is in the so-called schools in which we are given knowledge, it is there. Because Quijano also talk about hierarchies of knowledge. The knowledge itself as to who we are as people, as to who our worth or whatever, it comes down to us in what we accept as knowledge in capital letters. So if we go back to Othello and we see what is the view of the African then, not much different about it today. And finally, Quijano talks about the systems of culture in which the European culture was said to be supreme. All of our cultures was degraded. And those three aspects of coloniality, they intertwined to keep us in thrall. And I think this is a subject that is not being placed on our agenda, whether it is in the schools, whether it is in our social institutions, or wherever. Today I saw Bertie Ramcharan talking about we should, in talking about governance, we should have some philosophical understanding of it. Well, if the philosophy itself that was given to us and we accept and we're playing around with, if that philosophy inheres with saying that there is this hierarchy of beings starting from this white God, you get me, to the angels who are also always white, to a white baby Jesus, and to then white people, and going down all the way down, that's the whole point, all the way down to Africans. It's there, and it shows up in every which way. So that normalization, I would posit, I don't think, we're talking about the definition, but I just want to say this, that if we are going to, and I've written over this for 30 years now, and it's been like, you know, just, I don't know, water on duck's back. So I would conclude with this, that the normalization of race and racism has occurred over the millennia. And for us to get rid of it or even to attack it is not just something to talk about this government or that government or whatever. We have to go, we should do that also, but we have to look deeper beneath the surface and we will finally get rid of it, or else we'll end up just going over the same thing again and again and again. Thank you.
If I may throw in my own words now, just to make it simple, based on what the two previous speakers, Professor David Hines and Council Rafi Dev, it's the display of inconsideration, inconsiderable feelings towards the feelings of others, whether in spoken words or actions, that people generally do things and they're not thinking about what they're saying or what they're doing that may hurt the feelings of someone of another ethnicity, another ethnic group, or even another caste. So would you like to add something to that, Vincent Alexander?
First of all, let me say that the question of racial sensitivity or insensitivity may be a question that is rather universal, as much as it may be a question that one may look at in relation to a particular society. And whilst speaking to the general understanding, I would want to relate it to the Guyana situation. From a general perspective, racial insensitivity or sensitivity has a lot to do with how one ethnic group sees the other and relates to the other. One may say that a group is sensitive when it relates to the other group, taking into consideration their being and mutual respect across the groups. Insensitivity will have to do with when there is a disrespectful interrelationship and the absence of mutual respect. The situation which lends to the possibility of sensitivity or insensitivity, in the first instance, I think is a natural situation. Once you have a society where there are different ethnic groups, different cultures, different possibility of different languages, different value systems, but they have to live together, then there's likely to be either sensitivity, that is tolerance, or insensitivity, intolerance. Now, this is not necessarily an act of racism, because I always like to differentiate between racism and what in fact the topic is, racial sensitivity or insensitivity. Because you may have intolerance, you may have difference, but racism gets to the point where you feel that one group feels superior to the other. And racial insensitivity or sensitivity does not necessarily result in one group feeling superior. They may feel different, but not necessarily superior. So I tend to differentiate between racial insensitivity and racism. Suffice to say that this insensitivity can be manifest at different levels. It can be manifest at the interpersonal level. It can be manifest at the community level. It can be manifest at the wider societal level, and may find some manifestation in the manner of conduct of public affairs. So there are various levels at which one may experience racial/ethnic sensitivity or insensitivity. Now, in the Guyana situation, my contention is that naturally there would have been that sensitivity once we had a society where, in the first instance, you had the people of the indigenous people, and with the arrival of the Europeans, that in itself would have led to a situation of manifestation, sensitivity or insensitivity. The attitude of the Europeans, I would say, towards the Amerindian, the indigenous people, certainly would have put us in a state of insensitivity. And so, naturally there is some sensitivity, naturally there is some disposition towards each group. But in some regards, the insensitivity is not necessarily natural. It's very often engineered, where one group seeks to impose itself on the other group. And those are the circumstances in which one may well move from natural insensitivity to racism, because the imposition seeks to suggest some superiority of being by one group in relation to the other. And so I think that Guyana has been the subject of insensitivity that has been engineered in the context of the whole colonial system, starting with the coming of the Europeans and their attitude towards the local people, further engineered by the Europeans in trying to inculcate an attitude towards the people of African descent that they themselves are held, and inculcating it in the other ethnic group, the indigenous people, inculcating an attitude as well. And we have seen over the evolution of the Guyanese society, this engineering and inculcation of dispositions. And so we've seen a lot of stereotyping, a lot of prejudices, which are the manifestations of the insensitivity. But as I said, this occurs at various levels, and so it is not uniform. You can have sometimes at a personal level sensitivity, and you can have insensitivity there as well. It's not necessarily something that is uniform. And I may argue that it is not something that is necessarily constant as well, You may have periods where there are other factors that influence a greater insensitivity or greater sensitivity. So it's a very complex state of coexistence across ethnic groups in a particular society. A state which moves along a continuum from, one would say, cohesion, right up to the possibility of very antagonistic relations.
Well, thank you. I think that's absolutely brilliant for giving further clarification to the previous two speakers. So let's get now to the bottom of it. Professor Hines, you raised the important question, normalization. How normal is it in Guyana?
Well, it ebbs and flows. It depends on how each group sees itself within the context of the larger social and political motion of this society. Groups sometimes, as I said in my opening remarks, groups can feel a sense of triumphalism, or they can feel a sense of victimhood. And from both places, you get that kind of insensitivity, that kind of racial insensitivity that we have experienced over a period of time, over centuries in Guyana. But in the present configuration, where we have become a petrol state, and therefore the competition for resources increases, the competition for political resource, a la government, the competition for economic resources, the oil revenue that is coming in, that then raises larger question of management of race relations. And with the coming of oil, and not a concomitant commitment on the part of the government and the state to recognize that race relations would come into play in this new era, I think opens the door for insensitivity. And like I said, it comes from both sides. It comes from a sense of victimhood. It comes from a sense of triumphalism. And so therefore, where as we are seeing in Guyana, where the issue of distribution of political and economic resources heightens, then you see changes in terms of race relations. I would say over the last few years, since we have stumbled upon oil, I think it has become more normalized in Guyana. I can't remember in our post-independence history so many instances of public racial insensitivity. And I say public deliberately because people do express views on different racial groups privately. I would not deny that. But what we have seen here is this public display of insensitivity, the way in which the groups perceive themselves and then express themselves. Now, the question of management of race relations become very important. And in Guyana, there is no commitment to managing race relations because there is either a denial that race is an issue. That is one of the big problems in Guyana, a denial that race is an issue, or a recognition that race is an issue, and the possibility of this recognition that race is an issue, the possibility there of, in some instances, overplaying race. So you have the denial of race on the one hand, And then you have the overplaying of race on the other hand. And that does not allow for management of race relations. And so therefore, we have seen, I would say, in the last half a decade or so, more and more the normalization of racial insensitivity. Take, for example, half of the population is being socialized to believe that anyone from the other ethnic group that says, I love my group, is a racist. People don't have a knowledge of what racism is because they're socialized to feel that all you have to do is to, if you're African, wear a dashiki and say, I love my race, you're racist. And maybe that is part of the problem because our people are not sensitive to what race is. I mean, when African people talk about their condition and they cite the victimhood starting with plantation slavery, coming through in the post-plantation era, if there's not a sensitivity about why they raise the issue that they raise, or Indo-Guyanese, going through the period of indentureship and coming out of indentureship at a certain understanding of self and a certain view of the world, and so therefore a certain expression. If that is not understood, then other groups could become insensitive. And we all know that all of us, all the groups have been insensitive towards the native people, partly because they're invisible. They're not people, they're in the bush. And so there's a certain kind of insensitivity that comes from that. So I would say ignorance of race and racial history, denial of race and racial history, and the distinct possibility of overplaying the race issue that comes in that situation, I think are the contributory factors to the normalization of racial insensitivity in Guyana.
So Ravi, is it normal and how normal is it?
I want to repeat myself because somehow I don't think what I'm saying is being picked up on, or maybe it is irrelevant. I'd like my two co-panelists to tell me if it is so. What I'm saying is that, for example, both David and Vincent are using race and ethnicity interchangeably, even accepting that race is a universal phenomenon, not just confined to our ethnic differences in Guyana. I've always brought up the expression that China is one of the places that is most anti-African, and they never lived with African, they never mixed with African, by and large in China itself. I was during the beginning of the Ukraine war. I noticed that the countries around Ukraine, like Poland, refused to accept African students who were traveling, who were studying in Ukraine. So I don't know how many Africans were actually in Poland for them to have an ethnic problem. It's a racial problem. And I think we gotta always keep this in mind, that here it is that the Europeans took, for the first time in human history, physical characteristics, which are, you can't get rid of that, it's there, and tied that to an evaluation of that individual or those individuals, that by definition, they are subhuman almost. So that is why, for instance, in my entry into Guyana and Guyanese politics in the late 80s, I made that distinction and I've always kept it. I had a large debate, public debate, with a fellow Guyanese named Abu Bakr, who lived in Paris, in France somewhere. I wonder if Abu passed, because I don't see him anymore.
Yeah, that's true, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And
brilliant writer.
The point was that I was saying that I never use the word black, because black is one aspect of physical characteristics that the European extracted to define those persons as being definitionally inferior. Ethnicity has to do with your origins and your culture and all of that. And I think that is something that we can talk about. I insist on African Guyanese, Indian Guyanese, Amerindian Guyanese, and all that. To use black again is to accept by that system of knowledge that somehow a physical characteristic defines us. It might have socially defined us, but we should not perpetuate that. That's one thing. So the question is the normalization of racial sensitivity or insensitivity must come back to that question of race, how we understand it, and how do we, in a sense, disjuncture race from who we are. And that is a project that especially that we must get into the schools and disjunction those two things as to defining us by physical characteristics. Coming back to the normalization, we can look at it historically as people like Rodney did. That, for example, we saw, as Vincent said, when the Europeans encountered the Amerindians, they saw them in a certain light, right? I remember it, but now how did we see them? How did they put it across? In my days, an old man, back in my day, there was, I think in our fourth standard book or something like that, there was an Indian who had known no change, who stumbled along sunlit beach or something like that. But here it is them defining the Amerindian. Here was an Indian who knew no change, as somehow he was part of the landscape. He was like the trees, the mountains. He does not change. A set of people who came into this new world 13th century, millennia before, had to have known change. The very fact that they might come, the Arawaks might have come out of the Orinoco and sailed into the islands, meant they had to encounter change. Yet that is how those Amerindians were defined to us, that yes, they were faceless, they were in the jungle and they knew no change. And so on and so forth. For the Africans who were then brought, they were then defined as being subhuman, they had no soul. That is how Bartholomew de las Casas would justify slavery. And therefore they were doing Africans a favor to have them be with them, because there was a chance that, God knows, they may see the light. God, of course, being some gray-haired white man up there floating about in the sky. And we go on then to the Indians being brought in. And they were also placed in that hierarchy of the chain of the biblical chain of being. So when the Indian was brought, he was below those who had preceded him, both the Africans and the whites and the Africans. So Indians were derided as being heathen, as being dirty, as being untruthful, all of those stereotypes. In fact, there's a novel that had an anecdote of a lady being told, oh, 13 people died, some canoe capsized. And the other lady said, oh, that's terrible. Who were they? And the other lady said, coolies. And then the first lady said, oh, it doesn't matter, because coolies aren't really human beings. So what I'm saying, and that would have changed. The first Indians who then came off the plantation to go to Georgetown were of two categories. They first went in to clean the garbage, clean the drains, clean the trenches. They were like scavengers, and they were seen as such and derided as such. Others were milk sellers, that's their whole point. But what I'm saying is that the view of the Indian today, or the view of the African today, we must look at it as that on that continuum and see how can we then change that deeper imbrication of that Europeanized definition of us, and to begin to speak to each other and deal with each other on our own merits. And that is what I'm saying, my two co-panelists are not, to me, not avoiding that. I don't want to put any judgment to it, but we have to confront that, or else just changing the government ain't gonna change nothing. Ain't gonna change nothing. When Walter came back to Guyana, and he talked about the briefcase, bourgeois, who got independence or just was given to them. Nothing had changed when he talked about Shearer in Jamaica and what have you. So what has changed and why is because we are not looking at at two components: the system of culture, which keeps racism there and normalizes it, regardless of who's in government, whether you're in Russia, whether you're in China, or whether you're in Guyana, is the systems of knowledge and the systems of culture, where we still Europeanize. So, for example, I'm not putting down my two co-panelists, but for example, there was that wave where Mr. Guyana started a trend in Guyana of taking African name, because the act of naming, he pointed out, was a seminal act as to saying who you are, to take ownership. And I would have thought by today that would have become normalized, that the African name would not be derided and you'll make a joke about it, as and as people still do, of people with African names. And that is how you would begin that process of unnormalizing the European imposed racial categories and what have you. So again, I want to come back to it. We got to go deep, and we got to start somewhere, that's for sure. But we cannot ignore that root, how deep it is, all those roots that have already normalized racism. And I'm saying it'll be there for another millennium unless we recognize what it is and work at all those levels, especially in our country.
I think Ravi has made a very valid point. I mean, I remember teaching in New York City public school system for over 3 decades and showing the movie with Kunta Kinte and slavery.
Roots.
And you have African kids laughing. I mean, Black American kids laughing at the name Kunta Kinte and calling another African kid from Africa, yo, Kunta Kinte. And even, Haitians who have different names laughing at them, yo, Kunta Kinte. So they're putting down people with African names as though for them, it's like that's normalization of how one behaves in their value system.
Because the African is already normalized in every society as being lower. And unless we deal with that, you understand, we deal as to why that is and how wide it is and why it is still so persistent, we'll never get anywhere.
And Ravi is saying that normalization is there, and therefore we have to challenge it and move forward. So, Vincent Alexander?
Yeah, let me go back to where I began. I began by accepting that the theme, the topic, sensitivity in relation to race, is a universal issue. But I immediately specified that I was going to be dealing with this matter from the local perspective, the Guyana perspective, because that is where my problem is.
Mm-hmm.
And from that perspective, the first thing that has to be recognized is the lexicon. The lexicon. If you check all of the people, the sociologists in the Caribbean, they tend to use race and ethnicity interchangeably.
They do, yeah. Mm-hmm.
They use race and ethnicity interchangeably. Whilst I accept that that may be the case, even though the topic talks about racial insensitivity, I would argue that in the case of Guyana, it is not merely a question of racial insensitivity. It's a question of ethnic insensitivity. It's a question of ethnic insensitivity because what is used to drive the wedge between the groups is not their physical appearance. It's in fact cultural elements. So whether it's religion, and that's a big one, whether it's religion and other cultural elements, that's what's used to drive the wedge. When the Europeans came and they started to engineer this difference, it was not merely a question of white and color. It was a question of them and the behavior, the lifestyle of the others. And the extent to which it was a question of the lifestyle of the others, cultural attributes, is the extent to which it really took on ethnic connotations rather than the original, universal, black-white connotation. So for me, I'm dealing with it from that perspective. And from that perspective, I'm saying it is almost natural that if you have a society where there are people of different ethnic groups, the question of sensitivity will arise. I accept that sensitivity is also being engineered. And so one may see the Europeans engineering the sensitivity. But in engineering the sensitivity, they do not revert merely to their whiteness and somebody else's color. They have used ethnicity as the basis for engineering that sensitivity. And therefore, in the Guyana context, we have to look at the question of ethnicity, the difference of values, and generally the cultural differences. That's what we have to do. And to see in the resolution of the problem how we could develop mutual respect and mutual understanding of these cultural differences, bearing in mind that what has driven the problem is interests which are not simply cultural interests. They are economic interests which have driven the problem, but they have used the cultural elements to drive the wedge in the pursuit of economic interests. So yes, we have to look at the question, we have to see how we resolve this matter. And I'm contending that if you start to understand that there isn't, that there are differences, these differences are natural differences, these differences are cultural differences, and that the solution is coexistence, cohesion, then you can start to deal with the problem, the objective that was used, that is informed, has informed this engineering from a class perspective, rather than that cultural perspective. And in that way, you will have a different configuration of things to deal with, rather than to have to deal with people having ethnic sensitivity and ethnic insensitivity. You will then have interest sensitivity and interest insensitivity. And so one has to start to dismantle the superstructure which has been created to facilitate that base, because the superstructure is at the level at which the insensitivity really takes hold. But of course, it reflects a base. But we really deal in superstructure levels. So we have to be able to dismantle the superstructure so that we can directly address the base problem, which is the economic problem, which is in some regards was brought about as a racial problem by the Europeans for economic purposes. For economic purposes, we will find that in our circumstance, when we dismantle that superstructure, that is not a question of race. We have put ethnicity aside, and becomes a question of class. And that question of class will facilitate greater sensitivity across the ethnic groups because of commonality of interests.
Can we dismantle the superstructure, Professor David Hines?
Yes, the superstructure is about power. And it is about how we organize power and how we manage power. Because ethnic groups, ethno-racial groups, that is what the contestation is over. It's over power. And if we are able to dismantle all the power structure and to see power in a more racially democratic way, and I'm using that term deliberately, racially democratic, because in Guyana and most societies around the world, we talk about democracy in isolation from the places where we live and where we are analyzing. Often when we talk about democracy, we are talking about it within its Greco-European context. A democracy within Guyana context can't be a European democracy. We have to begin to talk about power in Guyana in a racially democratic way. Now, Ravi says that we are using the term race and ethnicity interchangeably, and that is true. Although, and I agree with Vincent, that our problem begins at the ethnic level, but we are conducting our ethnic contestation within the context of race. Race will always be present where African people are, because race came out of slavery. It was out of the slave project that the whole ideology of race and racism came into being. And so wherever African people are, that ideology exists. And so the ethnic contestation is carried out within the context of race. Rodney famously said, if someone uses my race to dehumanize me, then I will use race to humanize myself. So when African theorists talk about race, we are not talking about race as racial domination. And we are talking about race as a defense against racial domination, a defense against racism. And so if you're African Guyanese and you see domination by a government and a state that is controlled by another ethnic group, your racial eyes open big, because power for African people has always been within the context of race. And so therefore, you see a group, you see a government that is controlled by another ethnic group, and that government seeks to dominate the entire society. You then reach for the ideology of race to explain that domination. Ethnicity doesn't explain that domination, race does, certainly from the African standpoint. And so therefore, the term ethno-racism, ethno-racial is being used now in a recognition that one cannot talk about ethnicity outside of race wherever African people find themselves. But like I said, the African definition of race is not the European definition of race. And so therefore, we have to zero in on the question of power. I think if we normalize power in a democratic way, and I said this is not European democracy I'm talking about. I'm talking about in a fair, just, and equitable manner that ensures that all the different ethnic groups feel that they are part of exercising that power. I think that's a place to start. Ravi is very schooled on Arthur Lewis's book, Politics in West Africa. And he raises the very important point that Arthur Lewis uses the term extermination when talking about Africans in Guyana. It was not accident. It was not accidental because he was dealing with the question of power. And that if power is not democratized, Lewis is arguing, then the fear of the group that, or groups that are seen as minority, the fear of them being exterminated is real. Now, we may talk about ethnic minorities, but ethnic minorities, or the notion of ethnic minority does not necessarily mean that because they are, all the groups in the society are minorities, they're below 50%, that the specter of ethnic domination goes away. It doesn't go away, because somebody in the winner-take-all system has to win an election. Whether you win the election by quote-unquote crossover vote with your base, or you win it by manipulation, you win the election. And you win the election, the question of power arises. So I am arguing very strenuously that it is that superstructure, that way in which power is organized, that opens the possibility for racial insensitivity. Because groups that hold power have to justify why they have that power and justify why others don't have power, whether it's political power or economic power. Ravi himself is on the project of explaining why Africans don't have economic power. And in the process, he essentializes African people, because he talks about cultural behavioral patterns of African people that translate into their economic underdevelopment. I reject that. I reject that. I see the development and underdevelopment of groups as having the place within the structure of the society, including what Vincent is calling the superstructure, and not in cultural behaviors. You're going to find people of all ethnic groups jumping fence to go home at 4 o'clock when the shift is supposed to end at 6. A lot of Indians left their jobs today to go to the CPL before the time is over. You know, jumping the fence to go and party, or leaving work early to go and party is not an ethnic thing. It's not an ethnic specific thing. It is not an African thing. And when you have narratives like that, that say to people that there is something about your cultural being that make you bring second all the time, then you're opening the possibility there for racial insensitivity. People hear those constructs, and then they take liberty based on the construct that they hear. And so therefore, I think the question of power is what we have to interrogate.
So Ravi, Professor Hines and Vincent are saying that there is political contestation over economics, for control of the economy. And he's saying, Vincent, that we have to dismantle that superstructure. How can we, and Vincent is also saying that if we reach our class consciousness, we will become less sensitive or insensitive towards the other ethnic group. In fact, sensitivity will disappear. I suppose, using Marxist language, the disappearance of differences between the groups. What's your take on it? Because Professor Hines, made a lot of arguments.
You see, again, I come back to the question. David said he rejects the role of culture in explaining why we may be successful or not. I'm not so, I really, it baffles me how you can reject that. If culture is our way of life, of how we go about things, that it encompasses our worldview of how we see it. And I think David is alluding to something I said on another program, where I quoted Mr. Hoyt during the Genesis of a Nation commemorations in 1988, where Mr. Hoyt gave his talk and labeled it Beyond the Horizon. And he talked about Africans needing to look beyond the horizon, not to be so focused on near-term gratification, if you want to call it that. Now, we may say that's a stereotype, but like all stereotypes, there is a basis of fact, and Mr. Hoyt was a historian. He knew of what he spoke, and he was certainly sensitive to the African that challenge coming out of that history. So coming back to the example that Mr. Hoyt discussed with me, where he had located the Barama plywood factory down at the Garden of Eden and not in Region 1. And so therefore, African Guyanese on the East Bank could have employment. And yet he was saying on Friday night, right, he got a complaint from the manager of Barama. The workers would jump the fence to go to party. Now here again, it may sound again like stereotyping, but Mr. Hoyt was making a point which on a different program, the way I understand Professor Kimani Nehusi to say that we cannot ignore the question of culture. I'm not being simplistic. Like I forget that fellow, the American guy, Sam Lewis, who talked about a culture of poverty and all that. It's not that simplistic, but it is there. It is there that how we behave comes out of our culture. It comes out of our culture. And I know this for a fact because I am old enough to see in my own lifetime coming out of the lodges. I was born in the lodges of Iflat plantation, and coming out of the lodges, what it took to then try to get out of that. And I then grew up during the Burnhamite years, when Mr. Burnham, we talk of an African security dilemma, where he could argue plausibly that to other Africans, that if Africans were to utilize the system of democracy that was handed down, Africans would never hold political power. And coming back to David's thesis, Mr. Burnham took power, we may say he seized power, and he and Mr. Hoyt exercised that power for 28 years. For 28 years, and he was very conscious of the African predicament and where the African was coming out of the colonial era. So Mr. Burnham, and I said he's never been given enough credit for trying to alleviate the African condition. In Rice, as I've always pointed out, Mr. Burnham pretty much nationalized rice by ordering that all paddy must be sold to the government. He then utilized the government to construct large mills across the country and put them in the hands of African Guyanese. They were now the managers. So if, as a little young boy, I went down to Mahaika there, and you were thinking I was going back to the sugar estate plantations, where the manager's house, who were all of African descent, they had lights and they had a nice house. They were the managers. He opened up schemes where he gave African Guyanese land. And we can come down to his whole regime, as we discussed that in 1966, as discussed in the book by Professor Odell, that in 1966 he met Mr. Burnham in London, and he talked about politics in Guyana and what was going on and so on, because Mr. Odell had, Dr. Odell at that time was studying for his doctorate. But he asked Mr. Burnham, about the whole, the same thing that we were talking about, an equality of opportunity in Guyana, all that. And Mr. Burnham says he has to first empower the African Guyanese who are his base. And he proceeded to do that. So all I am saying, whether in his the trade that he now imported, right, the External Trade Bureau, where all goods were imported by the government and given preferentially to the KSI, whether it was in sugar where he imposed a levy and took out all the profits and then used that for other industries, whether for the GNCB that was there to give loans to African entrepreneurs who then utilized that. And we saw when it went bankrupt, we saw the names who were on that list of people who had outstanding loans. Mr. Burnham tried, and all of that, because he had power, which Dr. Hines is now calling that will solve the issue. The issue, I think, and I really am trying to be careful about this, when we assisted the WPA in 2005 to commemorate Walter's 25th anniversary of his assassination, there was a fellow, I think his name was David Trotman. I always don't get his name correct.
David Johnson.
From Trinidad?
Yeah.
And he came down and he went to the Esquibo Rural commemoration of the event. And
Yes, David Johnson.
David Johnson, okay. And I helped to think. And he told me, Ravi, and I discussed this with him. And he said, you have to be very careful about talking about this, because coming from an Indian in Guyana, where you are competing, when your group is competing with African Guyanese, you may be sensitive to it and all that, but it can be taken in the wrong way. And I've tried to avoid talking about it, but I don't think we can escape it, because I live in my own islet that has its own African section. And I grew up there. I pretty much, my whole consciousness was formed there. And yet I see that, and I want to talk very frankly, I think leaders like David Hines is still persisting on a course which has proven not to have delivered, if we look at the Mr. Burnham years. And still we want to go back to that as if power itself. And I want to conclude on this note, that if we are a nation of minorities, if you are rational, you would then tailor your programs to accommodate the other, your rhetoric, your programs, your whole initiatives have to take into consideration the other, because you need their votes. And that in itself, I believe, will help to, unnormalize, if you want to call it, whatever sensitivity there is. But the racial aspect, and I want to come back to where I started, the racial aspect, unless we deal with that very directly in our schools and in every forum, it will not have. Mr. Thorne, I read that, and my heart went out to Mr. Thorne, because here it is, he had to be a very successful man, the principal of our major art institution. So he was no guy coming in rags off the street. He had a vehicle. I presume it's be a different vehicle. He had all the opportunities, all of the paraphernalia of having been upwardly mobile. And yet someone, from what I read, could refer to him and denigrate him as a black man. You understand? It's race. It comes back to race, and we got to come back to this question of race. And we just can't conflate it and all that, because I'm saying to you, if it doesn't hit you here, it'll hit you somewhere else. I referred a lot to, there's this program by Chris Rock, and he's a multi-millionaire, very successful comedian, and he once challenged the audience of mostly white people, and he asked which one of them, the whites, would exchange their place with him on the stage. Not a hand was raised. Why? He was a millionaire. He could live well. He could be successful economically. But why? It was his race to be a black man, to have, a particular kind of hair, a particular kind of skin color. I'm darker than David. You understand? But when it is conflated as race, and you then, it goes back to that whole European thing. The anthropologist Brackett Williams talks about it as the ghost of the Europeans still in our head and controlling us. I end there.
Okay, so Vincent, in the interest of time, if you could summarize for us, and then I'll give David final word.
There's so much to be said.
Mm-hmm.
I maintain my ethnicity contention, but I accept that in the case of Guyana, the conflation of ethnicity and race has a lot to do with the fact that there are physical features that differentiate the ethnic groups in a sense that you can say, well, you're of that race. I can see myself
Can't escape that.
in race as opposed to someone else. So in a sense, to come back to David's argument that the African Guyanese could see things from a racial perspective because it is physically, universally is identified in a particular way. And it comes down to not just color, texture of hair and other physical elements versus the physical state of others. So there's some conflation there between race and ethnicity. But the real problem in Guyana, as far as I'm concerned, is an ethnic problem that may be influenced in some regards by racial ideology, but certainly not race itself. But I want to go a little further. Ravi, in his program the other night and tonight, has raised a very fundamental issue. And I asked the question, if what Ravi identified in terms of the African Guyanese, and he was speaking about Guyana, is an innate quality of Africans, or is it a peculiar quality of African Guyanese? Do you find the same quality? And I'm not accepting what he said necessarily, but I'm saying, would he say that if he goes to Barbados, he would find the same kind of narrative about the Africa in Barbados? I'm saying that to say this, that as we discuss the evolution of the Guyanese society, we have to be conscious of what has impacted the psyche of the different groups, and therefore what has fashioned the behavior patterns, which is but a part of the culture, which is but a part of the culture. And this is an extremely sensitive issue. It's sensitive if it is raised by somebody who's not of African descent, as Ravi has done. And it's sensitive if it is raised by somebody of African descent as well. But let me give you this example to explain where I'm coming from. This would be completely incomplete. This program cannot deal with this matter. Years ago, I engaged Burnham in getting some young people to get involved in farming. And they were prepared to get involved in farming. At that time, Burnham had something called Bell Brand, a co-op where he was involving young people from the East Coast in farming and other activities. For example, they were trying to use the coconut for everything that it could be used for, whether it's making mattresses, whether it's coconut water, everything. So he had these young men in this co-op at Belbrag. These young men were men from the village, the neighboring villages of Victoria and other neighboring villages. I was taking some young men from Agricola who he wanted for the purposes of training to go onto his farm before they engaged on the exercise I really wanted to be engaged. And so we ended up on Burnham's farm. And so there were two sets of people. The boys I took from Agricola, and the boys from the East Coast. And the boys from the East Coast said to us, So you see this farm beyond here? It's like slavery. The demands in terms of work and all of that, it's just like slavery. And that they were there for a purpose, but would not spend all of their time there overtime. For opportunistic purposes, they were tolerating this state of slavery, but they wouldn't tolerate it everlasting because it's unacceptable to them. And that exemplified a psychological state that I'm arguing is not innate someone of African descent, but has its origin in the way in which the Black personality in Guyana has evolved, given his historical experience, an experience essentially of oppression, and trying to free himself from that state of oppression and anything that symbolizes that state of oppression. And so there are psychological elements which are essential to the process of reparations, which are not purely, they're not innate to the African, and they are partly responsibility of the state in its reparative action to deal with, a part of which has to do with education, including the education of the teaching of history in our schools. Because an African Guyanese coming from a village experience where he was entrepreneurial and where the state oppressed his entrepreneurial endeavors and forced him into a public servant, a police and a soldier. In the circumstance now where he's being said, you know, you're dominating something that you shouldn't dominate. There's a lot that has to do with his psychological being. And the state has to take responsibility, not outside of the African Guyanese themselves becoming conscious, as Ravi contends some of them are becoming. But that state into which the African Guyanese evolved, unlike the Indian Guyanese. The African Guyanese came and was enslaved. He had to find himself. The Indian Guyanese was an indenture. He never had to find himself because throughout that period of indentureship, he was pursuing what he came for, though he might have been bitched into something that was not exactly what he expected, but he continued to practice his culture. It wasn't taken away from him. He continued to pursue the acquisition of wealth, which is what he came for. And so psychologically, he's in a different drive to somebody who has to find himself and who in the process of trying to find himself is exposed to tremendous oppression of what innately he is and can be because of this question of sensitivity. And so I don't think that we are fair and or objective and or understanding in our analysis of the society and the elements therein. And as a consequence of that, we can end up finding ourselves on the wrong end of things. And the extent to which the problem exists, in the manner in which it exists, I can even find myself on the wrong end of things in the kind of exploration that I'm engaged in. But for me, and I can pull speeches I've made it to the Party G, the African Guyanese problem has two dimensions, the material dimension and the psychological dimension. Both dimensions have evolved into what they are because of the historical experience of oppression of all forms of the African Guyanese. And therefore, you're right, Ravi, they could evolve out of that in a different a different experience, a different environment, and in an assimilation of what's taking place next door. But we need to understand that when we're talking about this sensitivity and all of that, we're not talking about the innate being necessarily. We're talking about the being that has been fashioned by social and other economic and other realities. But the being who in all of this fashioning has one objective: freedom. Freedom. And a lot of what may be seen as a dysfunctional personality may well be people striving in the context of what they've been exposed to for freedom, and stigmatizing things which probably should not be stigmatized, but stigmatizing them because they see those things as a part of the process that took away their freedom.
Okay, so David, we run out of time. You want to take a minute just to wrap it up?
Well, yes. I mean, Vincent has put it in context there. My problem with Ravi is not, and Ravi, I do not reject culture as an explanation for things. I just reject the way in which you take these reactions of Africans to the challenges they face on the plantation and off the plantation, meaning after slavery, and turn it into culture, turn it into something that is innate in them, and that is what I reject, right? It's not culture. The culture of the African is that he takes, for example, a steel pan and turn it into a musical instrument. That is culture. If people are responding, as Bob Marley said, every time I hear the crack of the whip, my blood runs cold. What he's saying is every time that plantation social relations stares me in my face, I respond in a certain way. And you then turn that into some cultural thing. Now, I went back and checked Mr. Hoyt's thing about beyond. Everybody exhorts their people to look beyond the horizon, look on the brighter side. Better days are coming. It was in that context the gentleman was making his thing. He did not say black people don't look beyond the horizon. He was exhorting people to look beyond the horizon. An Indian person can exhort Indian people to look beyond the horizon. It's a normal thing to do, to rally people. The other thing is, the people became managers under Burnham, became managers because they were public servants. Mr. Burnham didn't take Indian managers away from Guyana and put black managers. The blacks were in the public servants. Indians weren't there. So blacks became the public servants. Burnham didn't take away rice land from Indians and take Indian rice lands and give it to black people. That is the logic of your argument is that Mr. Burnham empowered Africans at the expense of Indians, which is absolutely not true. Mr. Burnham, of course, empowered Africans. One cannot deny that in some regards he did, but not at the expense of Indians, certainly not in the way in which you pose the question. Because what you're saying is Burnham empowered them, disempowered Indians, but at the end of the day, Indians are in front. So something is wrong with these black people. They were empowered, and because of something innate in them, they were not able to succeed. And that is absolutely not true. And that's the insensitivity. That's part of the insensitivity, Ravi. I try as much as possible to stay away from making analysis of Indian people, and I do it deliberately. It is not because I don't have views or I can't express views, but I stay away from it. Because I realize as an African, as an African public person, that my analysis could be seen as insensitive to Indians. I stay away from it. I do not criticize Indians for supporting the PPP. For example, if they feel the PPP coincides with their interests, it's their business, and I will support that. So I stay away from making those value judgments of Indian people because of the type of society that we live in and how insensitive it could be if I don't get it right. And in this instance, Ravi, you've got it wrong. But the objective here is to justify. You're saying that we are wrong in saying that African people historically have never been empowered. So in order to justify that they were empowered and that we are not telling the truth, you then reach for these kinds of arguments, which then speaks to something innate about African people. And it is that kind of stuff that one is responding to. I still hold the view that in the context of Guyana, if you're an Indian person, certainly of the stature of you, Ravidev, stay away from making value judgments of African people, because it inflames a response. And then the insensitivity leads to counter-insensitivity, right? I am not saying one should not express a view, but you got to be very careful with making those value judgments that then leads to insensitivity, because the value judgment itself comes from a place of insensitivity. You are very schooled, Ravi, on history, on African history, and you bring it to play in your analysis. But you have to also understand that there is a way in which you do not understand the African spirit and how it operates in its own habitat. And when you reach there, you may pull out something that's not true and not consistent with people's lives. And I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to justify certain outcomes. You're trying, for example, to justify why a party of one ethnic group goes in and gives people of the other ethnic group $40,000 and a fried rice, and you call it searching for crossover vote, and you're not taking in consideration how that assaults the African dignity. You see it as just politics.
So David,
there's an insensitivity there to the African dignity when you're saying it's okay to go into an ethnic group, the community of ethnic group, and give it $40,000 in order to get you, Ravidev, will not tolerate me or any politician going into the Indian community to do that. You will tolerate Nigel Hughes going to Lenora Market and talking to people. You will not tolerate him going in there and trying to assault the dignity of Indian people. And you ought not to justify it when it's being done to Africans.
So David, that's quite a tongue lashing. Let's give Ravi a final response and close it off. Ravi, a minute.
That's the thing. I told you, close this thing early. It's 2-1. Now, let's get serious, because it's a very serious thing. First of all, on that program that you alluded to, David, I specifically congratulated Nigel for going into Leonora. I congratulated Nigel for going into a scribble and reviving all the old contacts that he had picked up in AFC through the old Roar people, all went over to them. I paid him the compliment that was transmitted by those individuals, in that Nigel was the only person who, spoke to them like people, like responded to them, respected them. So don't give me this thing about not having. I encouraged Nigel in that, and I complimented him in doing that in his very first action. So that's absolutely untrue what you're saying.
No, he didn't go with $40,000 and a fried rice. You will not tolerate him doing that. You will not tolerate him doing that.
I want to come back to you. You can't tell me what I'll tolerate and what I won't do. Well, let me come back to this. The very important point, I want to compliment Mr. Alexander for his summation of his position. And I can see where we're going off here. So let me clarify it. I see only race as innate. And I can't emphasize, and that is what I don't use race. Culture is never innate. Culture is always learned, culture is transmitted, and therefore culture can be changed. It is only race that is innate. And race, I find it very ironic that, no, the way the Europeans have made it, because they have connected physical characteristics as innate as connected with intelligence or what have you. So by their definition of race, it is innate because your physical thing, you can't get rid of that. So that's innate. As to what it means, that's something different. That's racism. But so that is why I stress culture. Now, Vincent uses the term about being psychologically conditioned and all that. Well, that's an aspect of culture. That is an aspect of culture. One's psychology, it comes out of one conditioning. You don't have to be a Skinner believer in conditioning, but that's how we are conditioned in our homes, then in our schools and all that, and that becomes our culture. And so therefore we don't disagree. And I think we have to get less emotional about this. So that is why we have to be very honest. So picking up on Vincent's comment about going to that farm, I will give you the converse of that, Vincent, is that Mr. Burnham once went to Enmore, and he's finished with something maybe at the monument, the monument to the sugar workers dying and all that. And he's going down further into the Baghdad area. And he sees a wonderful farm, very immaculate, well laid out and all that. And he called and he asked, who's doing this farm here? And because it was on government reserve, and they brought the guy over, and it was an Indian fella, and he complimented this individual for keeping that farm that immaculate and that well, as a productive sector. And he then and there ordered that the land be transmitted to that individual. That individual is a relative of mine, and he still owns that land. He's not that old, he's still there, still has the land. His children are now farming it there. The point is, that's the whole point about it. Mr. Burnham tried to empower. We have to be honest, David. I know that's why for years I never spoke about it. But I am concerned about our future in Guyana. Guyana cannot go forward if one group is always seen to be below and the other group is above, whether, economically or any other ally you want to talk about. So I am concerned about the African Guyanese position in this country. But we have to be honest, and I think Vincent was very honest in talking about some of what is needed. And coming back to what Mr. Hoyt said, I discussed that speech with Mr. Hoyt. If you had really read that speech, David, you wouldn't have said what you said there. Mr. Hoyt referred to Orlando Patterson discussion of African people suffering what he calls social death, which is exactly what Vincent is talking about, an aspect of what Vincent is talking about. And having suffered social death on the plantations, and in all those definitions, the African man had to rebuild his own psyche in whichever way he could. And I agree with you, Vincent, that the human spirit will take whatever opening is there. We may not see it as that. But if in the modern world we have particular goals that we want, and if the avenue in it, what is seeking, is not leading to that goal, we have to be honest and say, buddy, we got to change our behavior. And that's what Mr. Burnham did. I have so many other anecdotes of him talking to individuals, because there were several ministers, including, what's his name, who just passed, Ramphal, you get me, who discussed these issues with him. And Burnham was never in any way shy about talking about what was needed. You get me? Both in Haiti, Dessalines was criticized for reintroducing slaves. You got to produce if you want to compete in the modern world. In here, coffee was accused of reintroducing slavery because you have to produce. So I know David, and I said I was born in 2005, but I'm an old man now. I'm at a stage in life. I don't know how many years left for me. I've made a decision to speak a little more honestly, come what it may, because I'm concerned that all groups in Guyana have to go forward or there will be no Guyana. Thank you, Vishnu.
That should be the last word. Sorry, gentlemen. Until next time, we will interrogate this subject again. Thank you. Good night, all. Thank you for joining us.